Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. The daily show going year by year through all 250 years of American history. Today, as we cover 1809, we'll be looking at the inauguration of James Madison, America's fourth president. We'll be continuing to look at the ongoing foreign policy regarding both France and England, and we'll look into the death of Meriwether Lewis. All that, plus a bunch of other updates from the year. Welcome to 1809 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and a man by the name of Moses Young sends a letter and enclosure to President Jefferson, containing a map that Jefferson says will be a valuable addition to the War Office. This map is massively detailed and comes in about 100 inches in height. It shows all the mountain ranges, capes, and rivers throughout the continent of South America, and provides a better insight into the continent than is available of America's own continent, North America, at the time. Now, if you remember all the way back to our 1798 episode, we discussed Eli Whitney signing a contract with the federal government to deliver 10,000 guns by the end of 28 months. It is today, in the middle of January, that the last of the agreed-upon 10,000 guns are delivered, 10 years after the contract was first drawn, and to a total profit of $2,500 to Whitney. The production of these weapons was made by largely average workers rather than skilled craftsmen, using a system created by Whitney to make firearms with interchangeable parts rather than to create the entire gun by skilled gunsmiths hand-fitting parts patiently and precisely. Over the last decade, Whitney has been in and out of court trying to protect his patent for the cotton gin, which doesn't see much financial success for the inventor. With this initial contract of 10,000 guns having now been met, and this system of production now in place, the factory in Whitneyville remains in service, churning out firearms faster and faster, and will soon inspire other federal facilities to operate in a similar fashion. Eli Whitney is not quite done interacting with our story, but this first major hurdle, meeting the requirement of the 10,000 guns, is now complete. On February 3rd, the Illinois Territory is created when Congress passes an act for dividing the Indiana Territory into two separate governments. Similar to other territorial splits as we've covered in the past, the goal is to create a more centralized government that makes it easier for the residents of any such area to approach and interact with their local government. The Illinois Territory sets its capital at Kaskaskia, and the new borders of this distinct entity extend all the way from the Ohio River to the Canadian border, and include all of what is now Illinois, most of what is now Wisconsin, and the areas in what are today Minnesota and Michigan, and for now, all this area is mostly still wilderness. There are about 12,000 Americans settling in the area, and an uncounted number of Indians at the time. If you want to see a photo of the borders of this territory, you can go ahead and check our X for today or search 1809 on that page. Now, on February 11th, Robert Fulton is granted a patent for improvement in steamboats. The patent is signed by President Jefferson and attested by Secretary of State James Madison, as well as Attorney General Caesar Augustus Rodney. Since we last mentioned Fulton in 1807, his ship, the North River Steamboat, has been in operation during all the warmer months, ferrying passengers to Albany and New York, with that river journey usually taking somewhere around 30 hours. Securing this patent is another step towards Fulton securing his claim to be the creator of commercial steam travel. And you can see some of the technical drawings and engine schematics on our X as well. which have remarkably survived from the time despite the infamous Patent Office fire that happens in the 1830s. Now, February 20th brings another major decision in the Supreme Court of the United States that we'll briefly look into here. The case we're about to cover grew out of a long-running dispute over the Active, which was a ship captured in 1778 by the Continental Navy and condemned in a Pennsylvania state court as a lawful prize. The ship's owners are British subjects, and they sued in federal court, claiming that the capture had been unlawful. In 1806, the Federal District Court for Pennsylvania ordered the Pennsylvania state officials holding funds from the Active sale to pay them to the British claimants. The Pennsylvania legislature responded with a state law prohibiting its officials from obeying the federal court order, and obviously this created a direct conflict. The federal court saying to pay the claimants, the Pennsylvania law saying not to pay the claimants and to ignore the federal court. As is usually the case with conflicts such as this conflict makes it to the Supreme Court, and in an opinion by Chief Justice John Marshall, he rules for the United States and against Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court holds that the federal courts have the final say in cases arising under federal jurisdiction. Pennsylvania's legislature and courts cannot nullify or block the enforcement of a federal court's judgment. The original order to pay the money to the British claimants by Judge Peters must be followed. To ensure that it is, the Supreme Court issues a mandamus, a court order commanding action, requiring the Pennsylvania officials to comply. This decision reinforces two key principles for the young United States. The ruling confirms that when the United States Constitution gives federal courts jurisdiction, their judgments are binding on state governments and courts. This comes only 6 years after Mayberry v. Madison, which is a case that we covered in detail, and this case, in 1809, further establishes the judiciary's power to enforce its decisions, even against resistance from a state. It essentially reinforces that the power of the federal government is greater than any individual state, even within that state's own borders, and cements the idea that federal law will remain the supreme law of the land, no matter a state's decisions. Now, continuing the saga that began with the Non-Importation Acts and continued with the Embargo Act of 1807, which was Jefferson's attempt to avoid full-on war during the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France by banning all American exports and most imports, cutting off trade with all foreign nations. The goal was to pressure Britain and France to respect United States neutrality and to stop them from seizing American ships. However, instead of really hurting Britain or France, the embargo devastated the United States economy, especially in New England and port cities where shipping, trade, and related industries collapsed. Smuggling became widespread, and the political backlash was extreme. With Jefferson's second term as president now ending, Congress is under intense pressure from merchants, farmers, and shippers, and they reach a solution by replacing the blanket ban with a more targeted approach. On March 1st, the Non-Intercourse Act is passed to replace the Embargo Act, and it lifts the total ban on foreign trade and allows trade with all nations except Britain and France and their colonies. This act also has a clause that states if either Britain or France stops violating the United States' neutral shipping rights, trade with the respective nation can resume. This still does not erase the American political opposition to the act, though it does ease some of the public anger that was caused by the full-on embargo. Unfortunately, what this act does not do is solve the underlying problem of British and French interference with U.S. shipping, as even neutral merchant ships not heading to one of these two European powers are still likely to face capture or search and the crew still likely to face impressment, particularly from Britain. Now, as the economic effects of the Embargo Act were absolutely felt throughout the United States, America, it seems, does not have the economic weight to throw around, at least as much as Jefferson had hoped that it would. And Europe goes largely unaffected by any of these acts regarding foreign trade, at least economically. These foreign policies are, however, important to a story that will be the focus of next week's episodes as we cover 1812 to 1816, and will be an immediate focus of Madison on his taking office. Which, speaking of, on March 4th, James Madison is sworn in as the fourth president of the United States, and George Clinton, returning from Jefferson's administration, is sworn in for a second term as the fourth vice president. Madison is the only man who had a role in authoring the Federalist Papers to be elected president, though he's now a Republican, and is the third of the United States' first four presidents to be from the state of Virginia. While we won't be reading the inaugural address in full, we'll go ahead and read the portion of the address in which Madison lays out the principles that he will be bringing with him into office. To cherish peace and friendly intercourse with all nations having correspondent dispositions. To maintain sincere neutrality toward belligerent nations. To prefer in all cases amicable discussion and reasonable accommodation of differences to a decision of them by an appeal to arms, to exclude foreign intrigues and foreign partialities so degrading to all countries and so baneful to free ones, to foster a spirit of independence too just to invade the rights of others, too proud to surrender our own, too liberal to indulge unworthy prejudices ourselves, and too elevated not to look down upon them in others, to hold the union of the states as the basis of their peace and happiness, to support the Constitution, which is the cement of the Union, as well in its limitations as in its authorities, to respect the rights and authorities reserved to the states and to the people as equally incorporated with and essential to the success of the general system, to avoid the slightest interference with the right of conscience or the functions of religion, so wisely exempted from civil jurisdiction, to preserve in their full energy the other salutary provisions in behalf of private and personal rights and of the freedom of the press, to observe economy in public expenditures, to liberate the public resources by an honorable discharge of the public debts, to keep within the requisite limits a standing military force, always remembering that an armed and trained militia is the firmest bulwark of republics, that without standing armies their liberty can never be in danger, nor with large ones safe, to promote by authorized means improvements friendly to agriculture, to manufactures, and to external as well as internal commerce, to favor in like manner the advancement of science and the diffusion of information as the best element to true liberty, to carry on the benevolent plans which have been so meritoriously applied to the conversation of our aboriginal neighbors from the degradation and wretchedness of savage life to a participation of the improvements of which the human mind and manners are susceptible in a civilized state. As far as sentiments and intentions such as these can aid the fulfillment of my duty, they will be a resource which cannot fail me. This same day, the citizens of Washington, D.C. reverse the idea of a presidential farewell address and write a message to the outgoing President Jefferson, which reads, "Sir, the citizens of Washington cannot forego the last opportunity which may, perhaps, ever occur to bid you a respectful and affectionate farewell. As members of the great and flourishing nation over which you have so illustriously presided, your virtues, talents, and services command their esteem, admiration, and gratitude. Embarked in the fate of this solitary republic of the world, they have in common with their fellow citizens rejoiced in its prosperous and sympathized in its adverse fortunes, as involving everything dear to freemen. They have marked with exaltation the firm column of its glory, laid on imperishable foundations, using as a monument of the reign of principle in this quarter of the globe. To you they have been instructed to ascribe the memorable act, which, by declaring a gallant people free and independent in a tone that appalled tyranny, instilled those sentiments and principles which, inspiring every virtue and urging every sacrifice, led them to triumph and empire. We have since beheld you with parental solicitude, and with a vigilance that never sleeps, watching over the fairest offspring of liberty, and by your unremitted labors in upholding, explaining, and vindicating our system of government, rendering it the object of love at home and respect abroad. It would be a pleasing task for us, as citizens of the United States, to fill up and extend the outlines we have sketched, but it is, as citizens of the national metropolis, that we now appear before you. In addition to every patriotic feeling that can warm our breasts, we have still further inducements to open our hearts to you on this proud yet painful occasion. The world knows you as a philosopher and philanthropist. The American people know you as a patriot and statesman. We know you in addition to all this as a man. And, however, your talents have extorted our respect. There is not one among us whose predominant feeling in this moment is not that of affection for the mild and enduring virtues that have made everyone here your friend, and you his. We should be lost to gratitude, did we not acknowledge that it is to you we owe much, very much of that harmony of intercourse and tolerance of opinion which characterize our state of society, of that improvement which, amidst unpropitious circumstances, has progressed with sure and steady steps, and above all, of that spirit of enterprise which your beneficence and liberality have invariably aided, and which promises in a few years to render this place the fairest seat of wealth and science. Deeply as we feel your retirement, we approve, nay, applaud it. Personal considerations aside, it was to be expected from the friend and protector of Republican institutions that he would follow, and by his cooperation strengthen, the example of the illustrious hero of the Revolution. May you, in the retirement to which you go, be happy, as your fellow citizens will still look towards you with interest, and pray for your felicity. So will you find it impossible to lose sight of the arduous scenes through which we have passed, as well as those in store for our country. Your heart will still beat with patriotism, and the energies of your mind will continue to be engaged on rational objects. In your retreat, may every anxious thought be softened by the mild and tender occupations of private life. Happy, thrice happy retreat, where patriotism and philosophy, friendship and affection will animate, direct, and soften the purest feelings of the heart. With a grateful nation, we pray that you may be happy, and if the just being that presides over the universe ensure to you but a portion of that felicity you have conferred on others, our prayers will be fulfilled. Signed by Robert Brent, Chairman, and Nicholas King, Secretary, March 4th, 1809. On the 9th of March, another signer of the Declaration passes away, Thomas Hayward, Jr. Hayward's father was a staunch royalist and wanted his son to receive the benefits of a good education. So the best school in the province of South Carolina was selected, and the younger Hayward became well acquainted with the Latin language and other such studies at the most respectable schools and seminaries in the colony. He then entered the law office of Mr. Parsons, an eminent barrister in South Carolina, before his father sent him to England to complete his legal education. In England, he was admitted to the Middle Temple, Cambridge University, in 1765, and on May 25th of 70 he was called to the bar by the Inns of the Court, While in England, Hayward saw the injustice of the prevailing feeling there that a colonial British subject was inferior and should be treated as such to the native-born Englishman. He commenced a tour of Europe, which mostly occupied him for several years, an advantage he enjoyed that many of the young people in the colonies would never get the chance to. It gave him a superior means of gaining a first-hand knowledge of the different countries of Europe, and he became radicalized in his years abroad and returned to his native land with a heartfelt desire to free it from the bondage of transatlantic rule. Hayward was among the earliest in South Carolina who resisted the oppressive measures of the British, and from the passage of the Stamp Act to the Battle of Lexington, he promoted the Patriot cause and rejected the submission which the British government demanded. At the age of 29, he was elected to fill the vacancy of John Rutledge as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in early 76. Just in time to enter upon the lengthy discussions of American independence, which he warmly supported. As we mentioned, his father was a royalist and much disapproved of his son's brashness in supporting the cause. Hayward joyfully voted for independence on July 4th and signed the famous parchment along with the other South Carolina delegates on August 2nd, a few days after his 30th birthday. His father admonished him and said that the British likely would hang him for this act. But the Hayward blood was thicker than politics, and the two men reconciled even before the outcome of the war was decided, and they remained close to each other before the senior Hayward's death the next year. Thomas left political life upon his father's death to come home and help the family plantations, but he was a signer of the American Articles of Confederation on behalf of South Carolina in 78. Hayward, like his fellow signer Edward Rutledge, accepted a commission in the South Carolina militia, and he served as captain of artillery. He received a gunshot wound in 79 in the battle where General Moultrie defeated the British and was scarred for life from it. During the siege of the city of Charleston by General Clinton, Hayward had command of a battalion, but was seized as a prisoner of war for being a leader of the revolution. He, along with Rutledge and several other men, were taken to the British fort of St. Augustine, Florida, and were held there until the war took a turn in 81. And during his imprisonment, he wrote a parody on God Save the King, the British national anthem, using patriotic verses, which became known as God Save the 13 States. I'm no singer, so I'll simply read out the verses that he penned, set to the same tune as God Save the King. God save the 13 states, long rule the United States, God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious, no tyrants over us, God save our states. To our famed Washington, brave Stark at Bennington, glory is due. Peace to Montgomery's shade, who, as he fought and bled, drew honors round his head, numerous as true. As of one family, all of one mind must be, will ever sing. We fought for liberty, be independency, not hereditary, we want no king. As Hayward and some fellow prisoners were being transported by ship to be released into Philadelphia, he narrowly escaped death en route from an accident where he fell overboard, but survived by holding on to the ship's rudder until he could be assisted. After the war, he returned to Charleston and served as associate law judge for South Carolina, and served South Carolina again as a delegate to adopt the state constitution in 1790. Hayward turned his attention to agriculture and worked to restore the family plantations, and was one of the founders of the South Carolina Agricultural Society. In 1799, he withdrew entirely from public life and spent the last 10 years tending to personal endeavors. That brings us to today, April 17th of 1809, where Thomas Hayward Jr. dies at the age of 63 and is buried next to his father in the family cemetery at his father's property. Now, in August, following refitting, the USS Constitution is recommissioned as the flagship of the North Atlantic Squadron, with Isaac Hull soon to be appointed as the ship's captain. This being another phase in its long storied history, though it'll be some years before the Constitution earns the nickname she's remembered by today. Now, in a bit of a grim story, but one that we're going to spend a little bit of time on November 4th, Meriwether Lewis, the governor of the Louisiana Territory, leaves St. Louis for Washington, D.C. to take care of some personal and professional business. After 11 days of traveling down the Mississippi River, Lewis and his servant John Pernier arrive at Fort Pickering in Tennessee. Gilbert Russell, who is in command of Fort Pickering when Lewis arrives, says, "The commanding officer of the fort, on discovering his situation and learning from the crew that he had made 2 attempts to kill himself, in one of which he had nearly succeeded, resolved at once to take possession of him and his papers and detain him there until he recovered or some friend might arrive in whose hands he could depart safely." Now, neither Russell nor any other contemporaries provide more details than that about the incident, but it's clear that Meriwether Lewis is not doing too well by the time he arrives at this fort. Lewis appears to have recovered after a few days of rest, and at the end of September he's off again to head to Washington. Now, one of the men accompanying Lewis later notes that he again begins acting, quote, deranged in the mind soon after leaving the fort, and on the evening of October 10th, Lewis, his servant, and another traveling companion arrive at the home of Robert Grinder. Though Mr. Grinder is not home, his wife is, and she offers the travelers room and board. Most of what comes next I'll be taking from a second-hand but contemporary source and interspersing some further explaining details. Lewis' behavior soon strikes Mrs. Grinder as erratic. For one thing, he begins pacing back and forth in front of one of the cabins, muttering to himself, and will sometimes look as if he's walking up to Mrs. Grinder, and then suddenly wheel around and walk back as fast as he can. Mrs. Grinder feeds her guests, but reports that Lewis has only eaten a few mouthfuls when he starts speaking to himself in a violent manner. She reports that his fits came and went, and that he would rage, grow calm, then flare up again, his face flush as if it had come on in a fit. Eventually, Lewis pulls a chair to the door of the cabin, lights his pipe, and gazes out at the Tennessee wilderness, and in a kind tone of voice, Lewis says, "Madame, this is a very pleasant evening." As the governor heads to bed, Mrs. Grinder reportedly has trouble sleeping, being mostly alone with a man she sees as unstable in an isolated frontier property. She then hears the report of a pistol and something fall heavily on the floor, as well as the words, "Oh Lord." Immediately afterwards, she hears another pistol shot, and in a few minutes, she hears Lewis at her door calling out, "Oh, madame, give me some water and heal my wounds." It is, of course, too late to save him, and after a long and painful night, by sunrise of the next morning, the 35-year-old former explorer is dead as a result of a gunshot wound to the head and chest. His last words, likely, "I am no coward, but I am so strong, so hard to die." Now, even much of the account that I just presented can be disputed because Mrs. Grinder is the only source for the last hours of Meriwether Lewis's life, but I've included only what I've found to be largely verifiable from other evidence. Now, I'm not a fan of trigger warnings, but I'll simply say, while we're going to here look into the incident inquisitively and look into some of the motivations that caused Lewis to take his life, I'm not saying that these are valid reasons. If you're in his position, talk to a loved one and seek help. Most of the mystery revolves around what happened in the early morning of October 11th. Lewis' family is under the firm belief that he was murdered by Pernier, his French servant. This viewpoint is expressed in a letter posted on our X today, which was written in 1901 by Sally Anderson, a distant relative of Lewis. Another man quite intimately acquainted with Meriwether is Thomas Jefferson, and he is convinced that his death is in fact a suicide, as are many others who personally know Lewis, including his old friend and fellow explorer William Clark. Most historians today also agree that suicide is the best explanation for Lewis' death, and list a couple of reasons. Firstly, he had faced severe financial problems. The War Department in Washington, D.C. had begun to refuse to honor some of Governor Lewis' vouchers, a few of them for very large sums of money, and the tone of correspondence from functionaries in the War Department to Lewis had become pretty aggressive. The word had gotten around even in the territory in which Lewis was governor that his official finances are being challenged at the highest levels of the United States government. This had the effect of causing most of his personal creditors to crowd in on him for payment. Secondly, he was unsuccessful in finding love. His friend William Clark had effortlessly courted and married Julia Hancock upon their return to the United States, and it's often said somewhat jokingly that her only fault was being the daughter of a Federalist. But at any rate, in the few years that have passed since their return, Lewis has begun thinking of himself as an old bachelor. He also has expressed dissatisfaction with his being governor of the Louisiana Territory, and despite the public's desire to learn more about his and Clark's American Odyssey, he was unable to prepare the expedition journals for publication. There are two other possibly contributing factors that are often speculated upon, though, again, unconfirmable. One being that he has begun drinking heavily, and another that he has contracted diseases, likely syphilis from the expedition westward, and malaria in the recent months. Thomas Jefferson suggests that Lewis actually had a history of depression, and that history of depression combined with any of the factors we just listed could have been enough to push Lewis over the edge. It's of course a tragedy any time that someone takes their own life, but especially so for a man who, at a young age, took on impossible odds, explored west for the greater good of all of America and the world, and who so often brushed death and made it out victorious. A brief report is soon published in local newspapers saying, "So many concurring accounts reach us of the death of Meriwether Lewis Esquire, Governor of Louisiana, by suicide, that we can no longer refuse giving credit to it. His death appears to have taken place on the night of the 10th, at the house of Mr. Grinder, near the Indian line in Tennessee. Everyone acquainted with his worth will feel a deep regret at this unfortunate event." Now, as I'd like to end the year with some more lighthearted facts, we'll look at legislation that comes from December 30th in Boston, where the wearing of masks at balls is legally forbidden. This actually follows the masquerade ball being banned in Philadelphia last year, as there is increasing moral panic over the idea of both prostitutes and promiscuous women taking advantage of the trend of masked balls for purposes I'll allow you to infer, with the ability to do so anonymously, thus avoiding both social and criminal repercussions. The act is obviously largely unenforceable, but at least in Philadelphia, it's meant to stop the promotion of events rather than the attendance outright. And as far as I can tell, no criminal convictions are recorded through either of these laws, though they'll remain on the books for decades. And one more fun fact about the year: while usually we will not recount birthdays as there's not much to say about someone being born, and we'll mention their life as they become relevant if they become relevant, this year, 3 men are born whose last names are so iconic that I'm certain you'll have no issue placing at least one notable thing each man will go on to do. Braille, Poe, and Lincoln. Yes, that Braille, that Poe, and that Lincoln. Well, that is all that I have got for 1809. Thank you for going through this journey with me and looking at some of the most notable facts from the year. We'll be continuing, obviously, with 1810 tomorrow, and I hope to see you there. This has been Our Story 250 Years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.